I'm Alex Samuels, political reporter with the Texas Tribune. Thank you for tuning in for a conversation on what the Black Caucus wants as part of the Texas Tribune's symposium previewing Texas's 2021 legislative session. I'm joined today by state representatives Harold Dutton and Nicole Collier. Dutton has represented House District 142 since 1985. He serves as chair of the Juvenile Justice and Family Issues Committee and is a member of the Public Education Committee. He was the immediate past chair of the Texas Legislative Black Caucus. Dutton also worked as an attorney for the law offices of Harold B. Dutton Jr. and Associates. Collier, meanwhile, has represented House District 95 since 2013. She serves as chair of the House Criminal Jurisprudence Committee and as vice chair of the General Investigating Committee. She also sits on the Business and Industry Committee and is the incoming chair of the Texas Legislative Black Caucus. Additionally, Collier works as a trial attorney and is partner at West & Associates LLP in Fort Worth. Chairman Dutton, I'll start with you. So there was a lot of talk over the summer and through Election Day about a potential George Floyd Act. Where do discussions on that stand now?
Well, let me start by thanking you for inviting me and Chairwoman Collier. Let me see if I can set the groundwork for this. You know, years ago, legislators recognized that police officers do a difficult job. They do a difficult job, and many times it requires split-second kind of decisions. And so what you don't want to happen, what you didn't want to happen, is for sort of the Monday morning quarterbacks to have to make decisions about the choices that police officers made. What we figured out more recently, though, is that a lot of these protections are now being used to save bad actors in police departments. That police department, there are some police officers who are being able to utilize these protections and get away with literally murder. And so one of the things we in the caucus have wanted to do is change the balance so that at least we provide, number one, a protection for police officer actions when they are valid, but we also do something more now to protect the public and particularly unarmed Black males from being killed by police officers who are engaging in this conduct, sometimes not once and twice, but 3 and 4 times. And so our discussion has been around how do we do that? Well, we do that a number of ways, obviously, but there are things we have to take a look at. For example, qualified immunity. That's one of the provisions we designed initially to protect police officers in the performance of their duties, and so that they would at least have some protections for doing certain things. But we got to change that. We've got to change the idea that police officers can leave one jurisdiction having engaged in bad conduct, go to another jurisdiction and get a job as police officers, unencumbered by their past. And so we've got to do something about that. We've got to do something about requiring police officers, good police officers, to not stand around and watch bad officers engage in conduct that's obviously threatening and sometimes harmful to the public. And these same police officers just stand there and do nothing. And so we have to have police officers, require police officers to take a police action or to stop bad conduct. We've got to do something about the arrest of people for non-jailable offenses. And we've got to do something about those. But those are the things that we've talked about. And more recently, what has really brought this sunshine to this was the report of the Sunset Commission on law enforcement in Texas. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at that report. I'm still going through it. But essentially what it says is several things. One is that we've got TCOLE, which is the Texas Commission on Law Enforcement in Texas. We've got that agency, and what the Sunset Commission describes as a toothless agency, an agency that can't enforce anything or cause anything to happen that we want to happen in Texas. We have now, as the Sunset Commission describes, we have a bifurcated system of policing, policing policemen in Texas. One is we do it by TCOL, the state agency, and then the local agencies all decide things that need to be done about police. But the state agency really does nothing. The state agency is really kind of the toothless tiger because it doesn't have the capability to cause anybody to do anything. And so we've got to change that. But that's essentially where we are.
And Chairwoman Collier.
Well, yes, again, thank you, Alex, for allowing us to be a part of this conversation for years. Ever since the Texas Legislative Black Caucus was formed, it has been our mission to be the voice and advocate for the Black community in Texas. And now is no different. Today is no different. We have, over the summer, over the interim, as a caucus, we have made it very clear what our agenda is, and that is to continue the efforts to reform the criminal justice system. As Chair Dutton explained, we have put forth, our members have put forth legislation to address the current climate. What we're seeing is a hodgepodge. You know, we have different police departments with different policies. So we want to aim to provide uniformity, some type of consistent system that the people of Texas can look to and say, this is what is expected of our law enforcement officers in all across the state. And so, you know, we had the Sandra Bland Act with Chair Coleman, and he's going to continue to move those efforts forward. But Chair Thompson, Symphonia Thompson, has brought forth the George Floyd Act to specifically address some of the concerns that we've seen in Texas. We are not immune to these occurrences of killing Black unarmed individuals in Texas. It is happening. And so we want to make sure that we have policies in place to address these issues. And that George Floyd Act, Representative Carl Sherman has put forth the Botham-Jean Act to address issues in that situation. So, and there's more that needs to be done. But as a caucus, we've recognized the severity of the issue. We are ready and always ready to stand with our fellow Texans, our Black Texans, and our Latino brothers and sisters to ensure that we have justice, accountability, and transparency in all levels of government. But the criminal justice system is not alone and immune to that.
Got it. And both of you in your answers listed a couple different bills that have been filed ahead of the 2021 session. I'm curious, is there specific legislation related to policing and racial justice that you would like to see passed to consider this upcoming legislative session a win for the Black Caucus?
Yeah, well, I think we'd like to have talked about passed, and certainly we recognize there are going to be some other bills, for example, in terms of use of force, use of deadly force, particularly by police officers. I think we're going to have to take a better look at those, at that kind of conduct, because I think that we need to change the standards by which we are making comparisons for police conduct so that we arrive at a situation where we can feel comfortable that a police officer engaged in conduct that's acceptable to all Texas. But when we've got the system we have where the TCOL agency, for example, sets minimum standards for training, for example. We have a situation in Texas where we require nurses to have more training than police officers. We require many of the areas where we regulate industries to have more training than we have for police officers. We ought to take a look at that. One of the things the Sunset Commission recommends is that a blue ribbon commission be appointed such that we can begin to take a look at all of this agency in terms of what kind of policing agency we require or to have in Texas, because I maintain, like they do, that one of the reasons we find ourselves in this whole morass of police misconduct is because, one, we don't have a state agency that provides the kind of oversight, guidance, training, and direction for local police officers that we should have. And two, we're now just getting to a point where the public can now see these things. This is not a situation where these things haven't been happening that the public now sees, but it's just now becoming visible to the general public to where they can see how police officers are mistreating the people that they run into on the street. And so to answer your question, I think we'd like to see all of these bills passed, but we recognize that all of these bills aren't going to pass. In fact, one of the things that I've been fond of saying all my career is that the legislature is where good ideas go to die. That's because we'll have probably 6,000 or more bills typically in a session, and only about a fourth of them pass. And so we've got to look at we're going to be faced with those kind of statistics. And then there's going to be the opposition that we're going to face. We recognize that this is the same opposition that's been around for years in terms of the things that the Legislative Black Caucus members have been proposing. And so we recognize that's going to happen, but we remain hopeful that we'll get enough of the legislature to at least understand and agree on the problem. And then there are things we can agree on to solve those problems.
And let me just add, Alex, what we're seeing as a result of the current state of affairs is that more and more of our colleagues are committed. They're announcing their commitment to make change, positive change. And we're not talking about, this is one thing I want to make sure that we're all clear on. The majority of law enforcement officers are doing their job correctly. They are there to serve and protect our citizens. It's just those who violate and do not conform to the policy of the departments of what is expected of somebody in that position that make it harder for the others. So, and we're also putting a lot more requirements on our law officers when it comes down to what they're expected to do. We're expecting them to be protectors of our safety, but we're also expecting them to be social workers, healthcare providers. We need to have additional collaboration. And that's something that the governor has stated that he's on board with addressing that. But let me just say let me say this. What he's talking about, making sure that we have additional collaboration between healthcare workers and law enforcement, is the same thing that those people who are talking about defunding the police are talking about, because it's reimagining policing. It's taking away or relieving them of some requirements that they originally did not have, and putting it where it should be. We shouldn't expect them to be mental health providers. We shouldn't criminalize people who are having a mental health crisis. And so that's what we're talking about when we're saying reimagining policing. So if there's efforts that are put forth that's going to do that, and it so happens to defund a portion of the police department, but puts it into another fund that has the same goal of providing protection for our communities, then yes, I'm going to support that, and so is the caucus. But when we're talking about some initiatives, there's bills that talk about the training that Chair Dutton talked about. We want to look at that training. We have filed at least 23 mandates on the types of training or the content of training. We want to use cultural diversity, implicit bias training. We want to talk about use of force. And when it gets down to the actual practice, we want to make sure that it's happening. And so, these are things that we're going to make sure that happen in the upcoming session.
Got it. And both of you have talked again about a lot of different bills that have been filed specifically on the House side. I'm curious if either of you have talked to Lieutenant Governor Patrick, Dade Phelan, the presumptive next Speaker of the Texas House, Governor Abbott. Has he been in contact with the caucus at all about some of the bills you guys have filed, and have the big three express their support for any of this legislation?
Well, I've not had any conversation with him about bills that have been filed. There was a time not too long ago, a couple of months ago or so, where the governor was meeting with Chair Collier and myself. I think we had 2 meetings and maybe 3, I don't remember exactly, but we were trying to get together so we could discuss these things. One of the things we realized was that the governor was trying to fashion a remedy that he said would pass the legislature. And I think what Chair Collier and I were interested in was passing something or developing something that fixed the problem. Because I think that's the first step we ought to make is try to fix the problem. If you start off trying to fix something that'll pass the legislature, of course, we don't even know who's going to be in the legislature at the time we was talking about that. But so the governor does have an interest now. The governor has come out more recently and talked about, backing the blue and doing all kinds of things that seem to be anathema to what the caucus is talking about. But I think that most people realize that, and I certainly haven't talked to the lieutenant governor about any of this. But we hope that as we move along this process, all the good members of the legislature will at least entertain the discussion about this, and let's see if we can agree to do something that changes the outcome of policing in Texas.
And with that, I just want to say that we have about 10 minutes left, and there are a couple different topics I want to get to, and there's a couple reader questions I want to ask. So Chairman Dutton, you had mentioned something about back the blue legislation, or I know the governor had a back the blue proposal that he was encouraging people to sign ahead of the November 3rd election. I was just curious, and this question is to both of you. Do you think these back the blue pledges will have any effect on a George Floyd Act or a George Floyd proposal at all?
Well, let me say this, and I certainly, to bring that up at this point in time is a way in which I believe that people are trying to establish an alternative to the measures that the caucus, the Black Caucus, happens to be advocating. This back the blue. There's not a person in our caucus or anywhere that I know of that don't back police officers, good police officers. I should say that. I have lots of friends, like we all do, who are police officers. And so the question was never about whether or not we ought to back the police officers. The question was whether or not we ought to do those things and provide those guideposts so that police officers engage in conduct that's acceptable to all of Texas, that the light can be shined on those efforts by police officers so that we all know what they're doing. We know that they've got the training. We know that they've got the right, engaging in the right conduct when things are at their worst out there on the street. And so I worried about that when I heard that the governor was advocating a back the blue. because this is not where we ought to choose up sides. This is not where we ought to have a red team and a blue team. This is not, that kind of contest. I mean, what we ought to be doing is recognizing that we're all on the same playing field. And as a consequence, our efforts ought to be designed to come up with the best solution in terms of what the problem is. If the Back the Blue effort is one that says, we don't have a problem with police officers, these are the people who are saying that we don't have problems with police officers. I would hope at some point they would take their head out of the sand and recognize that indeed we have a problem with police officers acting in some police officers, not all police officers, but we do all have a real need to sit down together, discuss this, and come up with something and make sure that we all remain safe in Texas.
And Representative Collier, I want to hear from you. My question for you is, what do you think about efforts by the state to tell local officials not to defund or rework police budgets?
Well, the state has been, for the couple of sessions that I've been there, slowly chiseling away at local control. We've seen this with the fracking legislation, with the tax issue last session, and now we're seeing the state attempting to come in and control a local community's budget. And so if we come in and say you cannot change the budget of the police department, then it could send certain municipalities into ruin. We need to be able to allow them to have that flexibility to control their budget and make decisions in what's best for them, for their particular community. And so I'm concerned about what I know about this effort. I don't know the whole thing because he hasn't laid everything out. But, because what if they just divert money to a certain area? Is that defunding the police? What does that mean? I don't know the full explanation of what he's doing. So that's something that we're going to look at to see if he is, what does he mean by that? But we need to give our local municipalities that flexibility.
Got it. And we have about 5 minutes left. There are
too.
2 more questions I want to get to.
Sorry. Go ahead.
Chairman, please. No, go on.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, the governor sometimes, with these efforts, it sounds almost like the people who live in the state don't live in the cities, or the people who live in the cities don't live in the state. I mean, I don't get it. When the governor decides to tell the city of Houston what to do, or the city of Dallas, why shouldn't the federal government come and tell Texas what to do? I mean, this just could go on and on and on. And so that's absolutely crazy. I think we ought to recognize that voters in the local, or just what we've always said, all politics is local, and we ought to respect that and honor that.
Thank you. And I want to switch gears a little bit and ask a question about the pandemic. So obviously we're going into this next session with a budget shortfall. I'm curious if there are specific issues related to the pandemic or the recession that the caucus is specifically focused on heading into 2021. And Chairwoman Collier, I'll start with you on that.
Thank you so much. So, for years, we've had our members, our Texas Legislative Black Caucus members, attempting to break down the barriers to access to healthcare and health services. We have been doing this for a long time, but one thing that this pandemic has done is exposed to the world, which we already knew, the disparities in healthcare and the inequities in healthcare, whether it is access or understanding health information. And so this pandemic, where we're seeing Black people die we're seeing Black people contracting COVID-19 at higher rates than white individuals. We're seeing Latinos dying at higher rates than other individuals. Latinos are dying at a higher rate and Blacks are right behind them. And so what this tells us, this pandemic tells us, is that we've got a problem. We have a problem in Houston, in Texas, which we've been having, and now all of the people are seeing it. And the numbers don't lie. We have work to do. We have to break down those barriers. In my community, there's areas that don't have a clinic. But if I go outside and I go to an area like Matt Krause's district, Representative Krause's district, he has clinics in their communities, in those specific communities. So it's about making sure that people have access, making sure they know where to go. And we want to do that. We want to break those barriers to access to health services and healthcare. And we want to also make sure that the information that's out there is funneled to our community, especially with this vaccine. We want to make sure, because we know that the Black community has been hoodwinked when it comes down to participating in trials. And we want to make sure that the information about this vaccine, that these vaccines that are out there are provided in a transparent measure so that we can get our community on board and make sure that they will participate and weigh their options to be vaccinated.
Right. I might also add that what this whole pandemic has done is the people who were living close to the edge, they got booted off first. I mean, and certainly I think what Chairwoman Collier is talking about in terms of healthcare is made far more evident by this pandemic. But I think there's some other things we recognize too, and I've been thinking about seeing if we could sponsor legislation around hunger in Texas, for example. Because one of the things that I recognized when I got out in these food distribution and mass distribution, we sometimes had cars in line that were 4 and 5 miles long to try to get something to eat. And I recognized that was a big problem in Texas. And so what this pandemic did is it exposed with greater clarity the disparities that exist out there. And we need to kind of talk about it and begin to do something about it. It affected our children more than anything. When you start talking about education, for example, education in the communities that the Black Caucus members represented were far more affected when it came to this pandemic and the learning that was occurring in regards to those children. And so we've got to do something that changes the dynamic or improves the dynamic. We talk about equality, and that's something we ought to always fix on. But the one thing we need to be aware of is we need to talk about equity, because equity says that we ought to take a look at where people are versus where they should be before we start talking about making it equal.
Well, thank you both so much. With that, we are out of time. I want to thank everyone for tuning in and say thank you to Representatives Dutton and Collier for joining us. So thanks, everyone, and have a good rest of your day.
Well, thank you for inviting us.